Hello, everyone. Welcome to Section 2. I'm hopeful that I'll have everything graded within the next week or so. For sure, by the end of spring break, everything to this point will be graded. So this week, we're going to talk about unions. So the unionization of public sector workers, especially criminal justice workers, is a fairly controversial topic among scholars, administrators, politicians, the public. There's a lot of different views on whether or not public sector employees, and especially criminal justice employees, should be unionized. Some view unions as essential to protect the rights of workers, and others view unions as serious impediments to meaningful criminal justice reform. Unions have been around. They really kind of started in the late 1800s and were fairly significant. There were quite a few of them until the Boston police strike in 1919, where 1,100 Boston police officers walked off the job and they had to call in the National Guard to restore order. So after that strike, the number of criminal justice unions declined significantly and kind of stayed that way. And then, kind of in the 50s, there started to be some real concerns about working conditions and hours worked and all that sort of thing. And then in the 60s and 70s, unions started to reemerge quite a bit again. So if you get to today, about like 13 states have a prisoner officer union, and a little bit more than a third of police agencies authorize collective bargaining. But more, it seems like the larger the organization, the more likely they are to be unionized. So more than 60% of police agencies that serve populations of 10,000 or more have authorized collective bargaining. So collective bargaining is when unions negotiate the terms of work with a designated representatives from the government. So it's the union negotiating with the government to define, work. They usually revolve around economic benefits and working conditions. Those are kind of the two main general categories that are covered in collective bargaining agreements. Now, as far as criminal justice organizations go, the ability to do this varies from state to state and even among criminal justice organizations within particular states. So if you talk about economic benefits, you're talking about things such as wages, retirement, health insurance, all those types of things. And they also, when you talk about working conditions, you're talking about policies and operations of the organization, stuff like job assignments, transfers, seniority type of issues, disciplinary action, procedures and methods for handling employee grievances, work hours, staffing issues, and any number of other various policies. So, I said there's two sides to this. Some are very supportive of unionization, some are not. So if you're looking at collective bargaining, there's various benefits for employees from collective bargaining. Obviously economic benefits are probably the most visible benefits and the most kind of well-known type of benefits that people associate with collective bargaining. Those that are in unionized departments generally make more money, are paid a higher wage, more likely to earn supplemental pay than those people that are not unionized. They're also more likely to have other fringe benefits, more sick pay, more holiday vacation pay, uniform allowances, those types of things. Some have criticized those types of increased benefit packages, but they found that in states that have unions and have these increased wages and increased benefits, they have higher retention rates than those states that don't have it. So then the question is, do these increased benefit packages offset the amount of money that have to be spent to hire and train new officers, and then how much is lost in productivity when an agency is short-staffed? So some of the negative arguments about collective bargaining. So critics of unions point out that collective bargaining agreements weaken the ability of administrators to make changes which can lead to a lack of innovation, inability to increase efficiency or effectiveness. Essentially, the collective bargaining agreements can keep administrators from kind of making unilateral decisions that we're going to do this to increase effectiveness or whatever. Collective bargaining agreements also impact discipline and accountability. A study from 2008 found that agencies with collective bargaining agreements were less likely to have civilian review boards or in-car cameras. And then the other kind of negative argument about this is that increased benefits and salaries have to come from taxpayers. It's not like in the private sector where if an organization or a business or whatever wants to give their employees a raise, they can do it from a variety of ways, and one of which is raising prices on their customers, or they can find other ways to get money. Government's not like that, right? These public sector organizations don't have the flexibility to find other means to pay employees. So essentially, all increases in revenue, so increased pay and all that stuff has to come from taxpayers. And then the final kind of negative side to unions is that unions are heavily involved in politics oftentimes, and sometimes that can be beneficial for organizations. Sometimes the unions take the differing stance from the government. So those are kind of the two positive and negative sides to unionization. All right, so let's say you're negotiating a collective bargaining agreement. Well, obviously, if you're talking about things like economic issues, pay packages, other kinds of benefits, or work hours, right? There's so many things that can be negotiated. Sometimes that's going to get contentious, right? The odds of the workers and the administrators, or the union reps and the reps from the government agreeing on everything is probably pretty small, right? There's going to be contention going on. So if the talks break down, or if the parties are having a hard time reaching an agreement, there's several things that they can do to try to resolve those differences. First is mediation. And mediation essentially is just getting a third person or a third party in there to participate in the discussions. The mediator's job is just to help facilitate discussion between the two parties. The mediator doesn't actually decide anything. They don't decide on any kind of settlement or anything like that. Another option is fact-finding, and this is used if the two parties can't even agree on the basic facts of the issue. Then they would hire someone to do fact-finding, which is where a third neutral party investigates the issues and determines what the facts are. Okay, so then the facts uncovered by that third party can then be used in the negotiations. And then the final option is arbitration. So arbitration is against a third party, but in arbitration, the arbitrator can actually make decisions on what the appropriate resolution should be, and it would be binding unless the parties agree that the arbitration would be non-binding. So let's say an organization they've gotten through all this stuff. The union and the organization can't come to any kind of agreement, so what are the options then? Okay, if none of that stuff works, what are the options for workers at that point? Because we're talking about government employees, most commonly in most places, state and local government workers are prohibited from striking, especially criminal justice employees. Only 10 states allow public sector employees to strike, but even in those 10 states, it mostly applies to just regular government employees. It doesn't allow police and correctional officers to actually strike. But even though strikes are illegal in most places, there still have been work stoppages by criminal justice employees over the years. And they've been resolved in a variety of ways. I'm not going to go into all those. You can read about them in the book. So even though strikes are illegal, and there's been some work stoppages, but normally police and correctional officers are not wanting to go on strike because it is illegal. They could be charged, right? They could lose their jobs. There's a variety of things that could happen to them. So what do they do since they can't strike? How do they express their dissatisfaction? Well, two of the most common ways are mass sickouts and work slowdowns. Mass sickouts, you've probably heard the term blue flu. That's what mass sickouts are more commonly called. And at first that just kind of referred to police officers, but I've heard it used across a variety of circumstances. But basically all that is that a bunch of people all call in sick at the same time, and that puts the organization in a very difficult position because they got to cover shifts, they got to figure out administratively what to do to cover all that work that's being neglected because people are calling in sick. The other thing they can do, or also do, is a work slowdown. And that's where employees still show up for work, police officers still show up for work, correctional officers still show up for work, but they do a very minimal type of job. So sometimes it results just in minimal work. Other times it kind of results in flooding the administrators with paperwork. And the two can go kind of hand in hand. It talks about in the book in Baltimore, some officers would fill out lost property reports for change that they found, in the street. And what that does is that ties officers up doing menial type of jobs. But also, depending on the kinds of reports, some reports have to go through administrators and through supervisors. And if you're filling out a bunch of kinds of reports that have to go through that stuff, now you've put additional strain on the supervisor and administration, another way to express dissatisfaction. So how can all this be avoided? Well, there's three main things that management should probably pay attention to try to avoid these kind of workplace issues. The first are salaries, workplace fairness, and the status of employees are the three main categories. Obviously, salaries and benefits they're a common cause of employees becoming disgruntled, not just in criminal justice. That's an across-the-board thing. People get disgruntled about their salaries and benefits all the time, regardless of what kind of occupation they're in. The problem with this in a criminal justice setting, as opposed to like private, is in private business they could just, they could raise salaries much more easily than you can in criminal justice or in government employees, because the administrators and management don't actually control the purse strings for that organization. Okay, so they can recommend salary increases, but if the legislative body says no way, there's not a whole lot that management can do about it. Another way is, when you speak of workplace fairness, what does that mean? Well, that means having fair ways of resolving employee grievances and resolving disciplinary procedures. Employees want to be treated fairly, and having appropriate procedures that are recognized and accepted as being fair helps to alleviate workplace fairness kinds of issues. And finally, employer or management needs to find ways to recognize employees for their value to the organization. And that's somewhat difficult in criminal justice. Obviously you could tell employees that they have value, but again, there's not a whole lot management can do sometimes because they're constrained by various other issues, constrained by legislative bodies, constrained by policy, constrained by civil service stuff. There's a lot of constraints placed on public sector organizations that may not be present, in the private sector, and it constrains them sometimes with being able to reward employees or somehow recognize employees for good work. All right, so I'm going to stop there for this week. There's two really good articles at the end of the chapter talking about unions and issues surrounding unions. As always, please let me know if you have questions. And I'll see you next week.